The Phillips Exeter Academy is one of those fancy New England prep schools that was founded just after the American Revolution, one that has been busy building its reputation ever since. It's a place with ivy-covered brick buildings where boys walk across campus in coat and tie to attend classes, where they sit around enormous oak tables discussing politics and Proust, and eventually trudge off to Harvard, Princeton, and Yale to make their parents proud. Although I am not that kind of person, and never have been, I somehow ended up at Exeter. That's a story in itself, but it's not the story I came to tell. That story is about a letter that came to my house not long ago. It was a letter from Margaret Spencer, correspondent for the class of 1977. She was asking me to please share a little bit of the news of my life so she could type it up for the class notes in the quarterly bulletin. She was begging, actually, because it's been so long since I've sent any news of any kind to Exeter. But there's a reason for that. The competition is just too intense. When I read through the class notes in the bulletin, I find that my classmates have been up to all sorts of interesting things since we graduated back in '77. Charlie Singer, who used to listen to American Top 40 every Sunday, became an executive vice president at MTV. His roommate, Jamie Trowbridge, took over his father's job as publisher of the popular Yankee magazine. Popular if you are a Yankee, that is. Tom Parkinson and his brothers started the Peapod Grocery Delivery Network. Steve Frary now owns the Oriental Trading Company, the one that sells all those tacky plastic prizes they give away at elementary school parties. And Carl Stork, the guy who used to work with me as a janitor in the Academy Library, went to work for a little company called Microsoft and recently bought a professional baseball team. As glamorous as it is to be a Baptist preacher, it is a very different life than that led by some of my classmates. They send in their news all the time, with pictures of the family skiing in the Swiss Alps or snorkeling in Tahiti. They talk about their book deals, their business deals, their latest professional triumphs. They say things like, loving our new vacation home in Singapore, or stop by next time you're in Athens. So, I'm reluctant to send my news to Margaret Spencer. Every time I read the class notes, my own perfect life seems to pale by comparison. I went to Exeter when I was 15 years old, and I like to joke that I got there on the poor preacher's kid from West Virginia scholarship. I don't know if that's what they really call it, but I did go on a scholarship. They have such a huge endowment at Exeter that they only start to ask the financial questions after you've been accepted. If you have money and can pay the tuition, then you do. But if you don't and can't, then you don't. I didn't and couldn't, but it seemed that everybody else did and could. I could walk down the hall of my dormitory and point out the rooms of kids whose fathers were heads of corporations, bank presidents, foreign dignitaries. I had never seen so much affluence in my life, and it made me feel that much poorer. Before I came to Exeter, I had gone shopping at the Goodwill store in Charleston, West Virginia, the fancy one. But these kids' entire wardrobes came from Brooks Brothers, Saks, Abercrombie and Fitch. Still, they were nice enough to me, and one of them invited me home for Thanksgiving break. His name was John, and he lived in Manhattan. We took the chartered bus to New York along with about 30 other kids from Exeter, and then took a cab over to his parents' condo on Central Park West. Central Park West, I say, where they owned an entire floor of a building that looked out over the park. I didn't know enough at that time to be impressed by the location, but I was impressed by the fact that when we got off the elevator, we stepped out not into a hallway, but into the kitchen of John's house. The next morning, he and I took that elevator down to the ground floor and walked out through the front door, where the doorman, who knew John by name, blew his whistle, and a cab came around and took us to FAO Schwartz, the world's biggest toy store. It was like that for the rest of the time I was there. We took cabs everywhere we went, and we went to fancy restaurants, Broadway shows, and expensive stores. I took it all in just as you might expect a poor boy from West Virginia to do, gawking up at the tall buildings and saying, "Golly," about every 2 minutes. On Wednesday night, John's dad drove us out to their place in Connecticut, an old grist mill that had won lots of awards for the architect who turned it into a home. It was beautiful and comfortable. And when we sat down to Thanksgiving dinner the next day, it looked like something from the cover of Bon Appetit. The cook had slaved through the day to get everything just right. I don't know that I had ever eaten a better meal. So it might not surprise you that during the dessert course, I decided this was the kind of life I wanted to lead. I wanted to do whatever you had to do to make that kind of money. So I could live in a swanky condo on Central Park West and take taxicabs everywhere and go to Broadway shows and then come out to the weekend place in Connecticut. I went back to Exeter determined to study hard, believing, along with everyone else who was there, that if I got a good education, I could get a good job and make a lot of money and buy a lot of things and be deliriously happy for the rest of my life. I may not have told you, but my dad, who was a Presbyterian minister, took what amounted to a vow of poverty when he went to work with the poor in West Virginia. Mom used to tell me that he could have made plenty of money, but this had been his choice, to come live among the poor as one of them, a kind of incarnational ministry to see what he could offer in the way of help. He thought it was just the sort of thing Jesus might do. So we lived in this old white farmhouse up on a hill. It and the 28 acres of land that came with it had been priced to sell at $4,000 when we bought it. And the first time my dad walked through the house, the floorboards in the living room gave way under him. The house didn't have running water. And so we carried buckets from a well up on the hill and used an old outhouse that had a beautiful view of the valley. I hadn't thought about any of this much before spending a week in New York, but when my friend John called and said he would like to come spend a week with me, I panicked. As I looked around and pictured John coming there, spending a week in that house, living with my family, well, I tried to talk him out of it. But he came anyway, driving down the next week in the new car his parents had bought for him. He got there on my dad's birthday and sat with us at the table for the birthday dinner. I couldn't help comparing the meagerness of that meal with the abundance of the Thanksgiving dinner I had shared with John's family. And then my mom brought out the cake, which looked embarrassingly homemade, and we all sang the birthday song and watched Dad blow out the candles. I kept glancing toward John to see how he was taking all this birthday dinner with the Clampetts. But he seemed to be fine, smiling and singing along with the rest of us. But when Dad started to open his presents, I remembered what I had bought for him 2 weeks earlier. Dad used to drive all over the place in those days in his old car with vinyl seats and no air conditioning. I would watch him get out of the car sometimes on a hot summer day with his thin cotton shirt glued to his back with sweat. So I had seen this ventilated plastic seat cover at Kmart that allowed the air to circulate between the driver and the seat, and I had thought it would be perfect, especially at the bargain price of $3. But that was before I knew John was coming. John, who probably bought his dad a new Rolex for each wrist. The closer Dad came to opening my gift, the more I squirmed, and when he finally took the paper off, I was mortified. Anybody in the room could see that it was the cheapest gift of all. And yet, Dad made this huge fuss over it, looking me in the eye and telling me how thoughtful it was and how much he appreciated it. It cost $3 for crying out loud at Kmart. And yet he acted as if I had given him a new car and not just a flimsy plastic seat cover. I couldn't even look at John. I just sank lower and lower in my chair, wishing I could disappear. But a funny thing happened. After spending a week with my family in the squalor of our West Virginia home, John wrote a letter to my parents, telling them how grateful he was for their hospitality and how much he had enjoyed the week. It was wonderful to be with your family, he said near the end. And I have to say, honestly, that in all my life, I have never felt more loved. My parents appreciated the letter and let me read it, and I could hardly believe my eyes. I looked at that last line over and over again, the one where John said he had never felt more loved. And then I began to remember how it had been at his house. I was too overwhelmed by the luxury to let it bother me much, but John and his parents really didn't get along. He would yell at his mother and she would get quiet, chopping vegetables in the kitchen with a pained expression on her face. John hated his little sister. As far as I could tell, they fought constantly. And at that beautiful Thanksgiving dinner, I had watched as John's father drank glass after glass of red wine and began to fold up as if he were made of wet cardboard, while John's mother sat at the other end of the table and glared. I hadn't wanted to see it at the time, but it was there. Lots and lots of money, very little love. Our gospel lesson for today comes just after Jesus has asked his disciples who people are saying that he is. John the Baptist, Elijah, or one of the other prophets, they answer. But you, he asks, who do you say that I am? And Peter answers, you are the Messiah. And then Jesus tells them what it means to be the Messiah, that it doesn't mean sitting on a big shiny throne in Jerusalem. It means suffering and dying. Peter can't believe it. It is so contrary to the way the world works that he takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him. But Jesus won't have it. He won't let himself be tempted by a worldly vision of success. Get behind me, Satan, he says. You are not thinking the things of God, but the things of men. And then he turns and says to the crowd, if any of you want to come after me, you have to deny yourself. Take up your cross and follow me. And then, if you will allow me to paraphrase, Jesus says something like this. Anyone who wants to be somebody in this world will end up being nobody. But anyone who is willing to be nobody for my sake and the sake of the gospel will end up being somebody very special indeed. What good would it do you to have a condo on Central Park West or a weekend place in Connecticut if in the eyes of God you were still nobody? Wouldn't you trade all that and more for the look in his eyes when he says, you are my beloved child, in whom I am well pleased? During that week in New York, I thought we didn't have anything. I thought my dad had given it all up to go into the ministry. But as I sat there, looking at that letter, I began to reconsider. It occurred to me that you could have everything money can buy without having the things that matter most. It occurred to me that my friend John would have gladly traded all the luxury of his life for just a little bit of the love in mine. And in that moment, holding that letter in my hands, I made a decision about the kind of life I wanted to live. I didn't go to an Ivy League college. And a few years after graduation, I did something very few Exeter alums have ever done. I went to seminary and studied to be a minister of the gospel. Years ago, I Got a letter announcing the 20th reunion of my high school class and asking if I would fill out a form and return it so they could put together a reunion scrapbook with pictures and information from everybody in the class about what they had been up to in the past 20 years. I remember filling out that form and thinking how strange everyone would find it that I had become a Baptist preacher. All those classmates who had gone on to fame and fortune. And at the time, I was pastor of a small church in a small town in North Carolina. Most people have never even heard of the place. But down at the bottom of the page, they asked me, "What lessons have you learned since leaving Exeter?" I thought about that for a while. I remember those days and the way we all thought we knew what success would look like. And then I wrote, "I think I have learned the truth of Jesus' life-changing question. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul?"